Our ancient wisdom this morning comes from the book of John and the book of Hebrews. From John chapter 20, we hear, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, 'Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you.' And with that, he breathed on them and said, 'Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven.' Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.' A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe.' Thomas said to him, 'My Lord and my God.' Then Jesus told him, 'Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And from the 11th chapter of Hebrews. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see.
Thank you so much, Mary. Good morning, Cameron. It is good to see you this morning, the second Sunday of Easter. Please join with me in prayer as we seek to reflect on the topic of resurrection realities. Resurrection realities. Resurrection realities is in many ways an oxymoron. It is the supernatural juxtaposed with the natural. It is the extraordinary juxtaposed with the ordinary. However, it is a term appropriate, I think, for this year's Easter season. As you know, last week I shared with you my struggles about coming into this year's Easter Sunday and celebrating the resurrection story. I promise you, Cameron, I wanted to come to you last week with a level 1000 celebratory Easter message. My love for preaching and my preaching ego wanted to have you just excited and whooping and wooting for last week's Easter Sunday. But my spirit, small s, and the spirit, big S, would not allow it or give space for it. I was forced, I felt, to surrender to the notion that it was time out for church as usual. I believe the Spirit of Jesus is calling us, compelling us now to be the church and to stop just doing church. Therefore, I was compelled to surrender to the risky truth that the liturgical calendar of organized religion does not always align with our lived experiences, and that sometimes it is absolutely necessary to pivot and live the reality of our truths, rather than live into the obligation of a liturgical season. Too often, church requires us to perform while leaving our while leaving the breadth and depth of our stories at home or locked away in secret closets. In fact, the United Methodist Church is having an internal war right now over whether or not we should be a safe and loving place for all people and all life's journey. Whether or not we should allow people to come in the fullness of who they are in all parts of our church, even ordained ministry. Beth Moore had to leave the Southern Baptist Church because she spoke up for women who dared to reveal their stories, the stories that were hidden at home in their closets, hidden in their tombs. But last week, Cameron, we changed the typical church story on one of the most important liturgical days in the life of the Christian Big C Church. I shared my heart with you, and in return, you shared your hearts with me. And not only did we share our hearts with each other, but we also shared the secrets of our hearts, the unmentionables, the things we cover up with our Sunday best in clothing and worship, the things that we don't usually talk about because we don't want to burden people or because we want to maintain a certain persona. As a result, for me, and I hope for you, a deeper meaning of Easter began to reveal itself. Easter is not just about commemorating and dashing past the tomb of Maundy Thursday, a day rooted in lies and condemnation, evil and oppressive systems and leadership that hung its hat on injustice rather than justice. It is not just about commemorating and running past the tomb of Good Friday, a day rooted in the slow, torturous murder and death of an innocent man, or even the torturous murder and death of non-innocent men. It is not even just about putting on our Sunday best and celebrating the liberation and resurrection of a man, both human and divine, but rather Holy Week and Easter is about pausing to look in our tombs, to confront the many ways we are dying to our humanity and our divinity, to confront the parts of us that prevent us from living into our potential and purposes as individuals, to confront the parts of us that prevent us from embodying unconditional love and grace with each other as human beings, to confront the parts of us that have imposed harm upon others intentionally and unintentionally, so that we can empty these tombs to live more and more into our spiritual lineage, our DNA of resurrection power and beloved community. I have always wondered why, by and large, people of faith, including me, are lacking in proclaiming and living a life of bold faith and divine assurance. Why do we not believe that the impossible is possible? Why do we always have to see it to believe it? Why do we live our lives in the mindset of scarcity and deficiency or insufficiency? Why do we live our lives more in regret than risk? Why are we so afraid of death, though we know it's coming one day, and thus we fail to plan for it? As I wrote this part of the sermon, I could not help but remember Dr. John Lee, who so sufficiently planned for his death and the time thereafter. planned it so, he was so committed to the planning of it that every pastor that came to Cameron, he immediately had a conversation with them about his wishes. Often, Cameron, there is not much difference between those of us who believe in life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus the Christ, or a divine source of life that is larger than us, and those of us who don't. So this year, I believe we are making a commitment to not only celebrating the resurrection of Jesus for one day and then going back to life as usual. I believe we are committing ourselves to his resurrection while also doing the work to live into our heritage of a resurrection people. We are a resurrection people. So the point of reflection for us this week is, how do we embody and sustain our spiritual heritage in our everyday lives when our personal and collective tombs are not empty? We must be willing to go to the tomb, to face that which is in the tomb. Just like the women in the biblical story on last week went to the tomb to care for the dead, to care for the things that prevent them from living their best lives. We must do the work in the tomb, as is shown in this week's biblical story. As so beautifully read by Mary, the disciples were locked in a room because they were afraid of the religious Jewish leaders. Cameron, we must go to the tomb to face the things that are preventing us from being our best. So what are you afraid of today? What rooms or aspects of your life are you locked in because of fear? We must do this work, as is shown in the biblical story where it says Jesus shows up and shares with them the wounds in his hands and the wounds on his side. We must do the work of being vulnerable with each other. As I think of Jesus as the Messiah and the Redeemer of the humanity in the human race, I am in awe and I hail his willingness to be vulnerable with the disciples. Yet, as I think of Jesus as a Middle Eastern brown man, I find it unfair that he had to share his vulnerability and seemingly shared it alone. Yet I perfectly know and understand that vulnerability is necessary if we are to ever get back the humanity of the human race. So what is the answer? We cannot run from being vulnerable, but it is imperative that the vulnerability is mutual. We must all be willing to be vulnerable with each other. I believe Mary Jane would call it a deep sense of presence with each other. We must commit ourselves to this work. Also, in this biblical story, it says that when Jesus showed up, he said to the disciples, "Peace be with you." We are being called today, Cameron, to do the work of justice and peace. We must be willing to receive peace. We must be willing to be at peace with ourselves so that we can then give peace to others. However, there can be no peace without the partnership of justice. This is why you hear the chanting in protest that says, where there is no justice, there is no peace. Yet this is the work that we must do. We must be willing to go to the tomb every day of our lives to do this work, to set ourselves free from our fears, to open our hearts and our minds to give and receive unconditional love, unconditional grace, and peace. For if we do this work, Cameron, if we do this work as individuals and if we do this work together, we will not only have to look for Easter once a year, we will be able to see, experience, and live Easter every day of our lives. And we will be able to live Easter in the resurrection, freedom, and power that is our spiritual DNA. I invite you now to unmute and pray with me the Lord's Prayer as we continue to ponder the work that we must do in this Easter season